Hi, Dr. Sam Dubé here once again for the Toronto Business Journal, and we're lucky to have with us today Mallory Moench, who is a City Hall reporter for San Francisco. Mallory, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, you wrote an article recently that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle where you talked about brazen shoplifting and it being a serious retail problem. What has the impact of this shoplifting been on businesses in San Francisco?
Well, shoplifting has definitely been an issue in San Francisco for a number of years, but police say that the incidents have gotten more violent and more brazen during the pandemic, even though more stores have been closed. Walgreens, a major retailer, obviously has shut down 17 stores in the past 5 years in the city. They do still have 53, but other smaller stores deal with this constantly. We've seen videos of cleared out shelves and people in hoodies stuffing bags in broad daylight. And the issue, especially with closing stores, has a big impact on residents who may need to go farther or out of the neighborhood to get the things that they need, especially if they are pharmacies. And some of those pharmacies now are also providing vaccines. So it's a big issue both for retailers and the cost that they incur and for the residents that they serve.
So, Mallory, what is driving this phenomenon? What is at the root cause here?
There's a number of issues. San Francisco has great economic inequality. There's many people who are homeless because housing is so unaffordable. Some of those people also struggle with substance abuse. So there are some instances of people who may be stealing to support that habit or more crimes of opportunity because of the economic plight that the US and the rest of the world is going through because of the pandemic. But actually the bigger issue, which was described by the head of CDS's, he's the director of organized retail crime in a hearing last week, he said organized retail crime is really amounting for a vast majority, 85% of the dollar losses of these retailers. And these are, he described them as organized networks where there'll be multi-layers of direction and they'll send shoppers out to hit maybe even a dozen stores a day with lists of specific items to steal. And then they'll send those off, they'll get a cut, and they're often resold online on Amazon or other online marketplaces. And they do find that a lot of the things that are sold around the country actually originate in San Francisco. So that's why he called it an epicenter of organized retail crime.
So there's a literal hierarchy of crime happening here. And I mean, is there any estimate of how many people might be involved or how many networks? Are they related? Like, is there any talk as to the organizational structure?
I believe there are a number of different entities involved, and there has been some prosecution and major busts in the past years of that in the San Francisco Bay Area, which extends beyond just the city of San Francisco. There was an $8 million ring that was busted last year of organized retail crime. So this has been on the forefront of the minds of police and prosecutors for a while and extends even beyond just San Francisco. But it appears from what they described that many of the actual stealing is occurring in downtown San Francisco.
So speaking of beyond San Francisco, then how do the costs of the thefts and the costs of the security to help prevent these thefts compare to other major US cities?
Sure. So I have CVS and Walgreens provided some of their data in the hearing before the city last week. In CVS, if you look at the San Francisco Bay Area, which includes a number of cities and 9 counties, 42% of the losses in CVS come just from San Francisco, while their stores are only 8% of the market share. In the Bay Area, Walgreens, they described and compared their costs for security and for theft in San Francisco. Theft, including the professional theft like they described, was 4 times the average of other stores elsewhere in the country. It was a little bit less of a gap for major cities, Chicago and New York. Chicago, it was 1.5 times more. New York, it was 1.2 times more. And as a result, the chain spent significantly more on security in San Francisco as well, even though it's not always successful and security guards have been assaulted at some of these locations. So Walgreens said they spend 35 times more on security guards in San Francisco than elsewhere in the country. It's also an expensive place, which has a higher minimum wage, so that's to be factored in. That is actually slightly less, they said, than in New York City, but it is more than in Chicago and in LA. And as a result, I mentioned that sometimes security guards have been assaulted and workers themselves do not feel safe and are trained not actually to confront these thieves if it could turn into violence. And Walgreens said that workplace threats in San Francisco are 20 times the national average.
So then the logical question would be, what is the appeal of San Francisco to these criminal networks? What?
I'm sorry.
I'm asking you what you think the appeal of San Francisco is to these criminal networks.
That's a great question. I think that maybe they feel there isn't as extensive of security or prosecution in the city. Some people discussed in the hearing also California's criminal laws, which some felt they have been made more lenient in recent years. So for instance, if you steal under $950, so just under $1,000 worth of items, then it's prosecuted as petty theft, a misdemeanor. It used to be a felony, and there are some restrictions in how police can respond to that. So if it's petty theft, a misdemeanor, police can't put out a warrant for that person's arrest unless they witness the crime themselves. So some critics and some retailers, Safeway, which is a major pharmacy and grocery store, blamed the new laws and the more lenient laws in California, which are trying to focus more on rehabilitation and not be so punitive to push people into the prison system. They criticized that as saying, well, people could come here, and they said sometimes people do know how to work that system. If they steal under $950, then they face lighter charges. It's much harder to prosecute.
So this is what you meant by brazen shoplifting then?
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the prosecution and these factors here. What has worked effectively for prevention and prosecution, and what has not worked well? You already touched on it a little bit, so if you could elaborate, that'd be great.
Definitely. I think right now it seems a bit more what has not worked well, but they're still working on what might work well. There are some ideas that police and the district attorney, the prosecutors are working on to think about how they could maybe work around these laws or different ways to prosecute a number of petty thefts. For instance, if they can prove that the same person stole less than $950 at one store and then went to multiple stores the same day and in multiple instances and did the same thing, they could prosecute that. They described a case where they did that recently for stolen scooters. They can also prosecute if someone has in their possession more than $950 worth of stolen items. So if they can hunt down that person and find that they already have it in their possession, they could enforce more penalties upon them. Other than that, police say that they follow the crime data, then they try to put out more patrols, whether that's foot patrols or parking police cars outside of these hotspots, especially at night, to try to deter some of these things from happening.
What do you think is going to happen in the near future regarding this phenomenon?
Well, I think that this hearing at the city level really brought a lot of more attention to this, and some of the officials, the elected officials, were surprised that this was majorly being driven by organized retail crime. And I think then there may be some effort from the city to try to perhaps put more resources into investigating that. That is something that they do. I mentioned that they had busted multi-million-dollar rings in past years, but it takes a lot of effort, obviously, and a lot of resources, even beyond San Francisco, because people who are committing these crimes could live in other counties or other cities nearby. So they probably need to work on a larger level and invest more time and resources into tracking down the root causes of most of these issues and most of these losses.
I was going to ask you, apart from the obvious price to the consumer, the retail prices going up, is there any other negative effect for the average consumer?
You can definitely see it in stores, and some of the retailers themselves spoke about it, where you have a lot more items behind lock and key, and it can be difficult to get them, and that can deter sales, which they said as well. Obviously, that's not a very customer-friendly option for them. So that is something that where it can be more difficult to shop, or shoppers said that they can feel unsafe as well. One elected official who is also a resident and a shopper said she went to her local pharmacy and someone had tried to shoplift and had pepper sprayed the security guard and the staff there, so she couldn't even go inside the store. So this is impeding the sales and also the services for residents themselves.
Mallory, you've been wonderful. Is there anything else you would like to add for our viewers on this issue?
No, I think that's all. Thank you.
Wonderful. So on behalf of the Toronto Business Journal, I'm Dr. Sam Dubé. Mallory Moench, thank you so much for joining us today, and I wish you all the best, and thank you to our viewers.
Thank you.